I'm here today. My name is Virginia Roach. I'm Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Fordham University. I'm here today with Mike McGill, who is the former superintendent of Scarsdale Public Schools in the state of New York, and also the author of Race to the Bottom, Corporate School Reform and the Future of Public Education. This book was rated as one of the top 10 education books of 2015 by the College and University Division of the American Library Association. So we're very pleased to be hosting Dr. McGill today. So thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
What I'd like to do is just to start by asking if you could talk a little bit about what the major tenets are of corporate school reform and what's wrong with it.
Well, since 1998 or thereabouts, we've been involved in what basically is an experiment in educational reform. And the experiment has been based on an assumption about what the problem is and who's responsible for it. And the problem, as at least it's been framed, is that America's public schools are failing. And the reason for the problem, as it's been posed, is that educators, teachers, administrators are self-serving or they are incompetent, and therefore they are the greater part of the problem. The solution, therefore, is for people who don't know a lot about the system to force those folks in the system to work and to do their jobs effectively. And the way that that's going to happen, or the way that's been say this differently, the way people have been trying to make that happen has been to assure that they are accountable. And the way we will do that, the way we've been doing that, is to use metrics, specifically standardized tests, to generate scores which can be used to rate and rank and sort teachers and schools. The theory being that when people are accountable and when they can be punished, then they will do their jobs. The other piece of the corporate reform theory is that competition causes people to perform better, and so we have charter schools and we have efforts like merit pay. Now, interestingly, it turns out that in the corporate world, these are only some of the mechanisms, only some of the ways that businesses try to be sure that they function effectively. They do a lot of other things as well. If you listen to Warren Buffett, he talks about giving his divisions sea room, trusting the judgment of the people in the field, not trying to overregulate, because that's the way you get the best performance. That's unfortunately not an element of the corporate approach that has been widely used in the school arena. So anyway, what's wrong with that? Several things. First of all, it's based on a faulty assumption or a faulty set of assumptions about the problem. There is no single school problem in the United States. There is no failing system. There are thousands and thousands of schools, some of which are very good, some of which are very bad, and a lot of which are someplace in between. And many of those systems are in places that are different from systems in other places. And so there's a wide range of problems, concerns, issues, conditions that shape all of those different systems. And the idea that one strategy can fix them all is simply mistaken because of that diversity. So that's one set of issues. Second set of issues is that while it's certainly true that in any system, schools included, some people are self-serving and some people aren't terribly competent, it's also true that in schools, as in most systems, the large majority of people are trying to do the job as well as they know how to do it. If they aren't doing it better, it's very often because they don't know how to do it any better. So if you want the whole of the system to improve, yes, you do need to be concerned about accountability, but the way to raise the vast middle is not by creating a system that punishes large numbers of people. The way to do that is by improving the capacity of the people who are the large bulk of the system. Somebody once compared this to the snake that ate the elephant. The front of the snake has a small number of high performers. The middle of the snake is where most of us are, and then there's the back end of the snake. And we have to be concerned about that, but it's that big middle that should be concerning us. So those are two concerns, or two sets of issues with the movement. And then the third set of concerns really is that the strategies haven't worked very well. If you look at the National Assessment of Education Progress, it turns out that achievement on the standardized tests that are the movement's own measure, there was as much growth in scores before any of these reforms were introduced as in comparable periods afterwards. And P.S., the achievement gap was closing back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, following the reforms that occurred in the Great Society, and it has not closed in the years since, or is not narrowed in the years since 2001, when No Child Left Behind was adopted. So even in its own terms, the reform process hasn't worked very well.
So one of the concepts you brought up in your book that I thought was very interesting was this concept of consumer-driven education.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and why you think it's problematic?
So over the weekend, I'm talking with a young couple from Boston whose daughter is in 7th grade, and they're thinking about what kind of school she's going to go to when she gets into high school. And the question is, will she go to the local public high school, or will she go to one of the private schools in the region? Mm-hmm. And it's really an interesting conversation because they're struggling with questions about a kid who is, I guess, somewhat insecure, very interested in ideas. She's a tall, 12 years old, and she's probably 5'7". You can sort of picture this kid going into some school environments and not having a very easy time of it. Also very academically inclined. So they're thinking, well, you know, is the rough and tumble world of public education really what this child needs? And as I'm talking with them, I'm thinking, I can really understand why you would be going through this kind of debate with yourselves, mm-hmm. Because in the individual case, many different kinds of schools may be available, but maybe only one kind of school is the best fit. So all of us, I think, as parents, think about what placement or what kind of placement would be best for our kids, and that's completely understandable. So we tend to view the placement process, I think, as a society, more than ever before, as kind of a consumer process where we should be the customers who get the right to find the place that will sell us what it is that we need for our particular situation and our particular family. The issue is that while that's a perfectly rational way of viewing the situation for a parent or for a child, it doesn't consider what is in the general welfare, what is in the interest of the general good. And if we understand that despite its flaws, one of the great successes of public education over the last century and a half has been to forge a society which is, for all its faults, more integrated, more understanding of diversity, more accepting of different kinds of people, more able to function as a civilized nation and as a nation that is trying to realize its own promises. That's what public education has become. And as we, to the contrary, become more and more fragmented, more and more concerned about our rights as consumers, we lose sight. The concern is we lose sight of that broader vision. We drain resources from the system that has been constructed to, has been built to realize that broader vision. And that poses a really grave threat to our success and, frankly, to our survival as a democratic society.
Okay. So, in that instance, we should forsake the issues of one for the benefit of the many?
I think it's a real dilemma. I think that we need to find. First of all, I think we need to recognize the paradox, that what is good for the one may not always be good for the many. Second, I think we need to invest, and I don't just mean money, but we need to invest the kinds of personal resources, the hope, the belief, the faith that this broader system, this broader approach to education, we need to invest ourselves in believing that that's important. And I think we need to try to make that system function as well as it possibly can, which is our espoused goal today, but not necessarily what we're really about. So in the long run, I'm not suggesting that we take away choice from people, but I am suggesting that we need to focus in a much more intentional way on building the broader system and making it great, or making it uniformly great, because there are parts of it now that are really doing a very fine job.
So let me ask you, one of the core themes throughout your book is what you experienced in Scarsdale in the early 2000s,
Right,
when your community basically was one of the first opt-out communities that we had in the state of New York. And it was just when the testing was ramping up in the state of New York. And the community in Scarsdale determined that they did not want to be part of that testing program, and so the parents opted out. In some sense, the opt-out movement is privileging the one over the many, if you think about it from an organizational standpoint. And I know that your district took a lot of heat for being seen as elitist. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not sure that it's necessarily, I'm not sure that it's true that some opting out is disadvantaging others. And I think that's a conversation we could have at greater length if you want to. But I think the broader issue is whether this really is an elitist phenomenon. And I think if you talk to people from urban areas, while it's certainly true that there's been greater support for this kind of approach over particularly the last few years in urban areas than there has maybe in some suburban areas, there's also a lot of concern and a lot of discontent in the cities. And the reasons that the cities have not responded the same way as suburbs, I think, sometimes have to do with the perceived value of the approach, but sometimes have to do also with the kind of leadership that advocacy groups in the cities have provided, and also the kind of leadership or the kind of direction that administrations in urban areas have provided. There are a lot of people in the city who I know have questions, and this is not from my own personal experience in New York or Syracuse. It's from talking to people, colleagues and others who work there. But there are folks who, at this point, have questions about the approach that corporate reform has been taking, but who also are either being told that their systems will lose money, or that their children in some way will suffer or will be punished if they don't take the test. So there are a lot of factors involved in determining how people in the cities are reacting. So I think the situation is more complex perhaps than simply one group of people out there in the burbs are viewing the world one way and feel that they're better than others, and that the folks in the city are feeling very differently about the situation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you talk a lot in your book about the testing movement overall and what you perceive as really the pejorative effects of the testing movement overall. The question for me is, okay, I'm a taxpayer or I'm a parent. If not testing, how will I know that the system is working? How do I know that the system is accountable?
Yeah. Well, I don't think any. I shouldn't say this. I'm probably being too categorical, but none of the responsible educators with whom I work and have worked over the years says that there's no place for standardized testing. The question really is whether we're using standardized testing as it ideally ought to be used, or as its originators intended it to be used. We certainly can use standardized tests as a temperature check on kids' performance. But the issue is that we use them more than we need to, and they're far more intrusive than they have to be. For example, we could do sampling techniques, we could use sampling techniques and test less frequently and still keep track of how systems, districts, schools are progressing. If we weren't using standardized tests so much for accountability and we were using them more to inform instruction, then in fact parents could get better information about what their children know and are able to do, because currently they can't get back information about individual student performance because of security concerns. We also, if we were doing this right, would be using a much broader array of assessments that would get at some of the skills, the abilities, the knowledge that that standardized tests don't measure very well or don't measure at all. Mm-hmm. And we could also be using other kinds of mechanisms to assure accountability of schools and districts. For example, we could be bringing in visiting teams of people from other schools, from schools and universities, to look at the quality of the work that was being done in the school on a day-to-day basis. We could also look at the outcomes that the schools themselves produce, and what are the graduation rates, and where are kids going to college, and what kinds of jobs are they getting afterwards. Those kinds of broad outcome measures certainly are important too. So the argument that I have is less with standardized tests. The argument I have is that we are placing way too much emphasis on the measurement of what really is a very narrow band of skills and abilities.
Mm-hmm. There have been a number of education critics who have talked about the need to actually have tests that teachers must purposely teach to, mm-hmm. Because of the concern that there is low capacity among the teaching corps. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I've experienced that myself. Mm-hmm. I have gone into classrooms where I've watched teachers say, this is silent E, and silent E takes its name. I'm thinking, no, silent E is silent. Or the list of spelling words on the board are misspelled. Mm-hmm. And in those instances, it certainly seems compelling that at least teaching to a test would be better than what's going on in the classroom. So is there a role for testing to actually guide the teaching in the classroom to support better quality for kids who have low quality teachers?
Well, I think there's a role for better tests to do that. Mm-hmm. And I think that as we develop a more sophisticated and broader array of assessments that aren't necessarily standardized as we know them now, that teaching to the test, in one sense, will become less of a concern. But another way of answering that question is that we really need to understand the wide diversity of quality of teaching within schools and across school districts in this country. Richard Elmore at Harvard talks about the variability in teaching. He says that the variability of teaching from one classroom to the next within a single school is as great as the variability among schools and districts, and as great as the variability among districts. So there's a huge amount of difference in what's going on in classrooms right down the hall from each other. So the issue is that we need to find ways to differentiate among teachers, just as we need to find ways to differentiate among our kids, and we need to find ways to differentiate among schools, as we need to find ways to differentiate among kids. So, in McGill's ideal world, what happens is that we do develop different ways of supporting better instruction, better teaching and learning in different kinds of schools and in different kinds of classrooms. I can imagine a world in which some classrooms, perhaps some schools, would benefit from a fairly reductive focus on today's standardized tests. But I have to say that I think that the number of those classrooms and schools is a lot smaller than the broad scale number that are being affected or have been affected over the last 20 or 30 years. So for me, the issue would be to find ways to use that tool where appropriate, and then to wean ourselves off of its use as quickly as possible where it's necessary, because the kind of instruction it supports, the kind of instruction it promotes is very rudimentary.
I mean, you've talked in our conversation a number of times about different kinds of mechanisms to provide either testable feedback to students and families about how their children are doing, or mechanisms to hold the systems accountable for meeting the needs of kids. And they're very admirable, but what I'm hearing is a laundry list of very expensive kinds of options. How could we feasibly afford those kinds of accountability systems?
Well, what will sound like a flip answer to that question, but if we reflect on it, what may be actually a very realistic answer to that question is that as a nation, we pour huge amounts, as a nation and as individuals, we pour huge amounts of resources into activities that are less important than this one. And so if, as a nation, we are serious about making a difference in the educational system, we really need to rethink our priorities, and we really need to rethink how we allocate those resources. And I'm thinking both of the federal government and the state government, but I'm also thinking of individual families. We spend millions and millions of dollars every year on basketball shoes and on other kinds of purchases that may make us feel good, may add to the quality of our life in one way, but which are not promoting the kind of education that's going to be necessary if all of our kids are going to be prepared in the future.
You make a case for stronger local control in your book, that basically through this testing process, we've gotten way too focused on the federal government and the state government in terms of their hand in what happens in the classroom. But when we think historically about why the federal government got involved in education in the first place, why states have been involved, oftentimes the path is because there were groups of people who were disenfranchised from the education system.
Right.
Students with disabilities, students of color, poor students. And basically local districts had the authority and they weren't doing anything about it. So How do we think, if we move away from the corporatization of American education and we refocus back on the local school and local district, how do we ensure that the rights of the heretofore disenfranchised are not going to be trampled on again by local communities that didn't bring them into the fold in the first place?
Yeah, this book actually is not so much an argument for local control as it's an argument for rebalancing the relationship among the different levels. The premise, which may or may not be clear, is that each level has a really important role to play. And you're absolutely right about the federal government and its involvement, for example, in the desegregation of schools and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which really were the first recognition nationwide that we had broad issues of racial and other kinds of discrimination that had to be addressed. Mm-hmm. States weren't doing it, localities were some places doing it, not other places dealing with those issues. So in no way would I suggest that we go back to a time where the localities are primarily responsible for day-to-day and the states and the feds stay out of the picture. What I am saying is that we need a new kind of conversation among the three levels so that each one can do what it does best. Interestingly, what conversation you and I had, interesting to me, maybe not to the rest of the world, the conversation you and I had some months ago, in that conversation, you made the observation that all education is so contextual, that what works is so much a matter of the culture of the individual school and the classroom, the relationships between the teachers and the students there, that it is very hard to prescribe set formulas that will work in every situation. So what I'm suggesting is that we have to, if we're going to be successful in this enterprise, we need to recognize that reality. Mm-hmm. And we need to find ways to say it differently. We need to open dialogue. We need to open channels of communication that basically don't exist between feds and the states and the locals, so that there's an ongoing conversation about how to help each one do what it does best. Mm-hmm. I think that at least in a state like New York, that kind of conversation is without historical precedent. Mm. Tom Sobel, when Tom Sobel was the Commissioner of Education, he talked about top-down support for bottom-up reform. And that was briefly, for a period of about 5 years, that was an articulated goal of the Department of Education. The door slammed shut on that with the coming of the late 90s and the early 2000s. There was a very brief window of opportunity. New York has never really tried that, and I suspect that most other states haven't either. That we've been caught in this idea of top-down, bottom-up, in opposition. So nobody, I think, is entirely clear on what it would mean and what it would require to have that kind of ongoing, authentic discussion. But I fear that unless we begin to find ways to create that kind of discussion, we're still going to remain stuck in this cycle of top-down, bottom-up, which basically leads us nowhere.
Do you think most superintendents today want to engage in that kind of a conversation?
I think there is wide diversity within the field. I think some people would be very interested. I think there are a lot of folks who are afraid of what it would mean for themselves or for their communities to begin to move out of a situation or move out of a dynamic that's comfortable and familiar. I think there are some folks who believe that the existing approach, that the corporate approach, is actually a good thing. So what I'm proposing is not easy, and it may not even be very likely, but I think it's what's necessary.
Now, there is a certain segment of conspiracy theorists in education, right, who believe that the corporate orientation to education reforms is actually a very thinly veiled attempt to demolish the public system as we know it and to privatize education. What's your take on this?
Well, I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe that there are kind of these monolithic forces driving anything. I just described superintendents in New York State. Basically, if you walk around talking to the 500 and however many of them there are, you will hear almost anything you can imagine and some things you can't. So I think the same thing is true if you carry the discussion to the corporate world. I think there are people in the political world and in the corporate world who would like to see public education privatized completely, and some of those people do have a profit agenda, and others have an anti-government agenda, and some of them have a far-right political agenda. Probably some of them have a far left political agenda for all I know. But I think, in my experience anyway, the large majority of people in at least the corporate world who've been interested in these reforms really are sincere in believing that they're going to make a difference in the quality of teaching and learning, or at least in the quality of the outcomes that kids achieve. I think what's difficult is that many of those people have a relatively little familiarity with schools, with public schools, and that oftentimes they're not clear simply because they don't know what the impact of some of their decisions or some of their positions are. So I guess I tend more to the well-meaning but not necessarily educated view of many of those folks than to the conspiracy, these are evil people trying to do evil things.
So you clearly have a take on the corporate model for school reform, which is not very positive. What's your prediction? Are we going to move away from this paradigm of education reform? How likely is it that we're ever going to dig out of the corporate school reform mode?
Well, you know, elements of it we're never going to dig out of, and some parts of it we shouldn't. I mean, the idea of developing better information, better data, which, if used properly, can help us improve learning. That's a good idea. The idea that we should be looking at subgroups within the general population to see how they're progressing, that's a good idea. So the issues with corporate style reform were never that the goals or even that some of the means were bad. The problem was taking basically unobjectionable goals or even laudable goals and approaches that in some cases made sense. I mean, testing isn't bad. Testing can be very good. But taking those and twisting them and perverting them into things that they were never intended to be. So, first of all, I guess I'd say that there are parts of corporate reform that we don't really want to get beyond. Second, I think we're at a point now where we're about to find out the answer to your question. We have a new Board of Regents, or at least a number of new regents in New York State. We have new leadership on the Board of Regents. A number of those people have serious questions about the direction that we've taken in this state over a period of years, and I think have a genuine interest in trying to find a better approach. Now the problem is going to be to sort out sort of the political fallout from what's happened, and to try to negotiate the political rapids associated with everything that's gotten us to where we are. And at the same time, to try to figure out what educational policies, forgetting the politics, may actually carry us forward. Be specific, that's a fairly abstract statement. And we've got a governor who has committed himself to, among other things, teacher evaluations by test scores. Where the regents go with teacher evaluation in New York State is partly a matter of what's good educational policy and what's responsible use of measurement, and it's partly having to deal with a governor who's already planted his flag on that issue. And as you go down the line, I think what you're going to find is that there are a lot of issues like that. If the educators and the parents could just go off and figure out these things by themselves, we would have one set of answers. But since the whole set of issues has become so politicized, much more complex to figure out how to negotiate those kinds of tensions.
So I would sum that up, and we're at an important moment of time, and we'll have to wait and see. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, if I were the king, it would still be hard. The mountain would still be high, but it would be possible to brush away a lot of these, what really are extraneous sets of concerns. And if I were the king, I would be able to look at my treasury and figure out how much money I want to invest in this cause as opposed to others, incarceration, for example. So that would be one situation. Probably most people are thankful that I'm not the king. So we're going to have to see how this all plays out. Yeah.
Mike, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. And again, the name of Mike's book is Race to the Bottom: Corporate School Reform and the Future of Public Education.